Hi, and thank you for watching these videos at the Audrain Museum Network. We really prize our viewers, and we've seen millions of views thanks to you. Why not take the next step and subscribe and be notified when we get new content here on the channel? Be a superbird. Come subscribe to the Audrain Museum Network. You all know who I am, and you're not here for me. Lucky, lucky, lucky folks. First of all, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming out and supporting the Audrain Automobile Museum as you do, and for joining me on a very special evening to share some time with a very special friend of mine. I am somebody who loves design, and one of the great things is that I was an art major when I was in school, and I thought I would grow up to be a car designer, and I didn't, which is fine. But the amazing thing is that the universe works in such strange ways that I have come to know so many car designers over the course of my lifetime, and none who I enjoy spending more time with than the man you're going to hear tonight. Not only is, wait, what's his name? Donald Osborne. No, not only is Ed Welburn an amazingly talented guy and, of course, a great trailblazer, but he is also one of the most humble people I've ever met, as all truly great and talented people are. And he's got a wonderful sense of humor, and considering his achievements, the fact that he is the 6th holder of the Senior VP of Global Design for General Motors to have existed up until the time he took the job, and there have only been 7 in the job since it was created in 1927. It's a responsibility which I can't imagine the weight of, and which Ed has borne with great lightness and humor. I just joked with him a few minutes ago that of all of his colleagues, some of whom were notoriously temperamental, that Ed is not only talented and wonderful, but also wins the General Motors Mr. Congeniality Prize, which is something really terrific. And before he comes up, I just also want to give a wonderful warm thanks, and I'd like a round of applause from all of you, for Victoria Antonucci, our museum events coordinator, who has put all this together so brilliantly. She's hiding so far back that she's even facing the street. Thank you, Victoria. And as they always say in the announcements, we are recording this presentation tonight, so don't be surprised if the back of your head shows up on the Audrain Museum Network on YouTube. And also, I want to apologize to our speaker this evening because I have inserted a surprise into his carefully designed show. So hopefully it won't throw him off too much. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ed Welburn.
Well, this is great to be here to see. What a great audience. Wow, I just want to take a moment and kind of take this in. This is good. Here to talk about a subject that I really enjoy, longer, lower, wider automobiles. It's an interesting subject. It's one that, one might argue that whole movement began with the second car that was designed. Let's make it a bit sleeker than the one before it. Others give credit to underslung because that allowed them to get that chassis down a bit lower, or the Hudson. The way the Hudson was configured is actually very brilliant. The way it was engineered, which allowed to get the occupants a little lower in the vehicle. Designers have always been inspired by race cars, and as Grand Prix cars and Indy Roadsters got lower and sleeker, and they followed suit with the cars they were designing, even if it were a conventional sedan.
I have to interrupt you for a second, Ed, because you said something very interesting about designers and their inspiration. And I'd just like to say, obviously, this is the...
here it comes.
Stand by. Born of the electronic age, the Cadillac Cyclone in its first public appearance. It's not a production car, but more of a rolling laboratory to test a score of new instruments, some clustered like the dashboard of a jet plane. A light touch, a lighted highway. Twin radar nose cones warn the driver with electronics when there's an object ahead. The exhaust is ahead of the front wheels. The clear plastic top folds backwards beneath the trunk deck. With the canopy up or down, the driver always has 360-degree vision. Doors also on the two-passenger GM test car. Panels that move outward and slide along the side on ball bearings. Here in Daytona, where the true auto fanciers are as curious about a new car as they are about a real Cyclone on the beach.
Now, I played that because, well, actually, tell them why I played this, Ed.
Okay, so as a kid, I was crazy about cars. And for me, going to the auto show, that was like going to Disneyland. That was my fantasy land, to go to the auto show. And when I was 8 years old, my parents took me to the Philadelphia Auto Show. I grew up in a suburb of Philly. And we're walking through the auto show, and I just loved the colors of the cars, the music, the whole thing about it was fantastic. And as we're walking through the show and it got to this particular exhibit, there was this concept car it was all roped off, stanchioned off. It was the show car that they just showed. And I'm standing there with my parents. I'm 8 years old. My father's on my right, my mother's on my left. And I told them at that moment, when I grow up, I want to be a car designer for that company. And it's a true story. I can't exaggerate that story at all. And, you know, as a little kid, I was a very slow reader. And my mother tried everything to help me with her reading, special classes, all this. But she decided, you know, this kid's crazy about cars. I'll get him subscriptions to car magazines. And I would read those things cover to cover, you know, and it really helped me with my reading. And through the car magazines, I found out where that concept car came from. And I was a slow reader. I was 11 by the time I figured out where it's from. And and at age 11, I wrote my first letter to General Motors Design, asking about careers in design. And they sent me great information, and I just followed their instructions. And there we go.
Next step, global VP of design.
Yeah. By the way, the global part, my predecessors were not global. And they were North America. They had some influence over studios around the world. But I was 2 years into my leadership. I was able to convince the leaders of the company, the chairman and the board of directors, that all of those centers around the world should be under one leadership. If you think about it, Chevrolets are designing in Brazil. They did whatever they wanted. In Brazil or in one of the other locations around the world, even the logos were different for Chevrolet. There were like 29 different Chevrolet bow tie logos around the world. And so I was able to get all these studios to work together with one bow tie and one design aesthetic for the brand. And then I did the same with the other brands too. And it all worked in coordination. It was 11 studios in 7 countries around the world and close to 2,000 creative individuals that were part of the team. So yeah, it was fun. It was a lot of fun. But at any rate, we're here.
Derailed you long enough.
We're here to talk about longer, lower, and wider. And let's go to the next slide. Harley Earl, who was the first leader of GM Design, absolutely, by the way, he had retired about 12, maybe 14 years before I started. And there are still quite a few people who would work for Harley Earl who were there. They never called him Harley Earl. It was always Mr. Earl. Mr. Earl. And it wasn't until more recent years that I even heard anyone call him Harley Earl or Harley. Yeah, I think he might, I don't know what would happen. But they all refer to him as Mr. Earl. Well, Mr. Earl loved long, sleek designs. And he loved aircraft, he loved sleek boats, and he loved sleek cars. And go to the next slide. This was really, and it's interesting, I had this series, it's going to be about 4 photos here. I had these taken about 18 years ago, and this is the first time I've actually used them. It's just The car on the right is the Buick Y-Job. It is recognized as the first concept car done internally for a company in the world. And the Y-Job was pretty radical, and it was Harley Earl's first serious look at a longer, lower, wider, sleeker design. Next slide. It was, I mean, look at it. You know, and many people have seen the Y-Job, but they've never really seen it next to a car from the same period. This is a 1938, you know, it was designed 1938, and there's a 38 Buick next to it. Very much the same design language with both of them, but the proportions are so different. They both use, the Y-Job uses a standard Buick chassis, but all the suspension was modified. He went to smaller wheels to get the car lower to the ground. It's all about getting the car lower to see how much lower the fenders are, and the base of windshield, the cowl, everything is so much lower on the car. Next slide. I mean, look how radically different. I mean, it was, you know, you think about concept cars today and how some of them are pretty radical. That is radical to have that kind of difference between the cars. Next slide. And even in side view, there are a number of things that he did. First off, the wheels were smaller. The top was integrated, all contributed to it being a sleeker design. There was a long line that really uninterrupted around the length of the car. A lot of designers with their sketches, they would put these lines on it to make it look like the car was moving. It was in motion. And they're called speed lines. And Mr. Earl said, well, why don't we just put the speed lines on the car? And these lines just really made the car look faster and longer and sleeker. And all those elements contributed to making that car so very special. He also used to commute to work in this car. And I can just imagine what this was like on the streets of Detroit back in the day. Next slide. Now, during the war, and this could be a whole nother subject, a whole nother story, during World War II, when a lot of the designers were off at war, and Harley Earl really had turned his attention to the military effort. And they turned the auditorium into a place to display over 90 different military devices that they created, and some of which went into production. And in fact, do you know, are you familiar with the very first Buick Wildcat? Anyone familiar with the first Wildcat, what year it was? Actually, the first Wildcat, it's a trick question. Okay. The first Wildcat was actually a cannon that they designed for the military. It went into production and was built in the Buick plant in Flint, Michigan. They called it the Wildcat. And then after the war was over, they designed a Buick Wildcat, the automobile. There you go, you can use that. Okay, so next slide. So, you know, he had a secret studio, though, that he continued to design, an advanced studio, that during the war they were doing these lower, sleeker designs. Always in scale model or in sketches. They didn't build full-size models of them because their main effort was the war effort, but they continued exploring. But as soon as the war was over, he created the LeSabre. And this is actually the clay model of the LeSabre. It was even lower than the Y-Job. I mean, this is really, I mean, see how low the fender is compared to the tire itself. Even by today's standards, it's extremely low. The only thing that prevented the whole car from being any lower was the engine itself, and they had to clear that and then clear the tires. But this is an extremely low car, and you see Mr. Earl standing next to it. He was a tall guy. In fact, I think some of the cars he designed, I'm not even sure he could actually fit. I don't think he could. You know, I give him credit for designing the first Corvette. I don't think he could get into it. The very early Corvettes are a challenge for me. And if the top is on, it's becomes like an Olympic event to get into the car. But speaking of lower, lower vehicles. So at any rate, the LeSabre really explored a lot of technology. Next slide. Here's the car. You know, it's one of the cars that I led the restoration of when I took over. In fact, you know, although my focus was designing the future, during the years that I led GM Design, we restored or heavily maintained or updated 17 historic GM concept cars, and this was one of them. By the way, the LeSabre is not a Buick. It doesn't have Buick on it anywhere. It was just a concept car for General Motors. It is the GM LeSabre, and later on, Buick took on the name LeSabre. Oh, this little.
By the way, for those of you who remember, of course, the wonderful exhibition that we had here at the Audrain, GM Design, and the Wildcat and the LeSabre were both here, and we had a wonderful historic photograph with Ed and some of his colleagues there, the people who were speaking to each other. And at the same time that they did this, Harley Earl went on to develop some concepts for Buick and for Cadillac that were very low cars, much lower than the production vehicles. Next. Meanwhile, the production cars is 1950 Chevrolet. Very cool design. You can see where it really flows and all of that, but it did not take on that lower quality that Mr. Earl and his team were doing internally with the concept vehicles. Next slide. And it progressed to the 55 Chevrolet, 55 and 56, great cars. They still weren't getting lower, really. It's a sleeker, it's a far more modern car than the 50 Chevrolet, but it didn't take on that lower quality. Meanwhile, next slide, crosstown rivals, Ford, was, you know, they were watching what Earl was doing. You know, Harley Earl's concept vehicles were shown publicly, and they went from this very nice 50 Ford to, next slide, 56. They really got sleeker, and they got it quite a bit lower in the process. And, you know, it's kind of upset, you know, and they were moving at a quick pace and getting a lower, sleeker design. Next slide. Now, before the 57 Ford was introduced, a member of Harley Earl's team got a sneak glimpse of it in advance and raced back and told them that Ford for 57 was getting much lower, much wider, much sleeker design. Harley Earl's team was caught flat-footed. They had developed the 57 Chevy, and it was done. The design was done when they got word of Ford moving and doing the sleeker design. So they were very limited in what they could do to make the 57 Chevy longer and lower. They put smaller wheels on it. You know, 55 and 56 Chevy had 15-inch wheels. 57, they went to 14-inch wheels to get the car down lower and change the proportions a bit with the vehicle. They added some moldings which really made the car look longer. They tried every trick they could at the last minute to help the car. The car didn't sell that well. It's really loved today, but 57 Chevy did not sell that well. The leaders of General Motors were very upset that Harley Earl was showing all these great concepts of lower designs to the world. Other car companies were watching it and making movement, but yet General Motors was not moving at the same pace. So, next slide. So they cut their losses, and then by 58, they did a much longer, lower design. They worked real close with engineering to develop the X-frame, which allowed them to drop the occupants a bit more in the vehicle and then absolutely lower everything. Very unusual framework, the X-frame. But 58 is kind of a rather substantial design, but it's quite long and sleek in its own way. And then the next year, if you go to the next slide, they went much leaner with the design,
even longer, and all the lines. You can really see an aircraft influence in the design really from end to end. Just think about it, that 1950 Chevrolet that I showed a few slides back, and here's 59. I mean, the pace of change was incredible in that period of time. How they changed in design. Next slide. Meanwhile, Ford was moving at same kind of pace. This amazing pace that they were moving at. If you think of that 1950 Ford that I showed earlier, and then you look at, this is 1960. Incredible pace. I would argue, at least from a styling perspective, that the 1950s saw more change than I think any other decade from a styling perspective. And you look at those examples, that 1954 Ford to the 1960, or the 1950 Chevrolet, and then the later Chevrolet. That change was absolutely amazing. Next slide. One of the things, yes, one of the things that occurred, in the 50s, as the cars got lower and sleeker, the station wagons, which were purely a derivative of those sedans, they used the same doors quite often and the same windshield and chassis and all that, a more heavy-duty chassis at times, but same design. As they got lower, in many ways, they lost some of the utility that they once had, and quite evidenced by this photo. Although this wagon is from the 80s, it pretty much represents what happened in the 70s. I would say in the 70s may have been the absolute lowest and widest of all the wagons. But yeah, you could still carry a 4x8 sheet, and that was one of the criteria. I never forget that, and it being in the studio. Okay, I must admit, I did work on this design in the 80s, and
I love these cars.
And well, they're becoming quite popular. Yeah, and a 4x8 sheet was part of the criteria in design as well. You couldn't stack them very high, but a 4x8 was part of the criteria. Next slide. I absolutely love this wagon, 1940 Buick. And other than the base of windshield, it's very much the same size as many of the minivans and SUVs of today. I mean, if the base of windshield was further forward, it would be very much in keeping with that. It's easy to get in and out of, nice space inside. Great car, great looking car. Next slide. Now, there are many people who, woe is me, the sedan is going away. We love the sedans, they're all going away. From the 1930s to 1970, it's interesting the change that happened with this lower, wider design aesthetic. Next slide. Although sedans have changed quite a bit from this one, I think it pretty much represents the kind of change that occurred over time. Next slide. This slide kind of gets at where I've been building this presentation to. Today's crossover sedans or SUVs are pretty much where cars were in the late 1930s. Next slide. I mean, it's quite interesting. So everyone, woe is me, sedans have gone away. I'd argue that these vehicles, these crossovers, are exactly where sedans were at one point in time. The base of windshield is not too far away from the same point, and this is really the smaller SUV. The next size up is probably right on, and the windshield height, all of that, they're both quite similar in size and in character. Next slide. Now, and the interiors are very much the same. The seat height, the relationship between the seat and the floor, the seat, the steering wheel, all of these relationships are rather similar, next slide, to the crossover vehicles. Not a good comparison in photos, and they're two-tone, so you don't really see that, but the floor, the seat, the steering wheel are quite similar. It's that chair height that I think customers enjoy. It's much more like the interior, a seat in your living room at home, as opposed to something where you're dropping down in. Hey, I love low, sleek sedans, I do, but I totally understand why people have really moved to an aesthetic like this. Next slide. So there we go. And I wish I would have had a smaller sedan than this for this photograph, but I think you get the point, the idea as far as the heights and all of that. It's kind of interesting how we've gone full circle, and based on what I'm observing in the marketplace and what I know of from a number of car companies going forward, these crossover SUVs are starting to get a hair more sleek and a bit lower. Yes, they are a bit lower, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves over time. I went through the images fairly quickly. I guess I'd like to just spend some time just talking about all of this, or anything in design you want to talk about. I'm here, so we might as well take full advantage of that time.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm going to start off by breaking the ice, because your presentation, when we first talked about doing this in conjunction with the Land Yachts exhibition, and you said, oh, yes, I've got this presentation that I'd love to give you because it's an amazing thing that I discovered and realized. So I said, okay, it's always going to be interesting. And then when I saw it, I thought, oh my God, this is so incredibly obvious. Now the next question is, this wonderful evolution that we've seen since the 1930s through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and to today, you mentioned already that there is a second part of this already occurring. I guess the question is, for me, in terms of a sedan, will we see the reintroduction of the trunk? That's what separates the crossover from the traditional sedan.
Yeah, there's several reasons why I'm not sure when you'll see that occur, but I think at some point there will be a designer who will do some cool design you just have to have. But I think people like some of the utility that comes with a more hatchback, more of a two-box design. Fuel economy and aerodynamics and all of that will also have an influence. We'll see. Or maybe there's yet something else to come that is different than either one of those, I believe. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing. I had a conversation with a young person a few years ago when Ford announced they weren't going to build any cars anymore.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, it's a terrible thing, they're not going to build cars. And so he said, I really love cars, and we had this discussion. And I asked him how long he'd had his license. He'd had it for a number of years. And what cars had he driven? He named all the vehicles he had driven. He had actually never driven a car. He'd only ever driven SUVs, crossovers, and trucks.
Yeah.
But to him, it was a car, because that's sort of, the car became generic, like Kleenex or Frigidaire. It was, the tissue and the refrigerator.
Yeah.
It was just a car.
Yeah, but and I think a few slides back, that Hudson, and then the Cadillac is kind of, I think it's a great comparison of the two. Yes. Any questions?
Sure, there are. There are a lot of people here who have Corvettes. I know they've got much.
And I wondered if part of the reason for the demise of the trunk might be related to wind tunnel and fuel economy, and that because you can see how far that rear tire has slid back in the design of cars. Is there any truth to that thought?
In general, it's easier to get real good aerodynamics with a two-box as opposed to a three-box design. Although, I think you can get excellent aero with a trunk. Once you make the car very slippery, it's if you're going to have a trunk, you need a good opening to the trunk. And if the opening is here and there, then that's fine. But if if that opening gets small, no matter how large that trunk may be, if the opening's small, then you've got a problem. So having an opening from here all the way down kind of helps in that regard. It's all these elements to balance. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about Corvette Evolution and whatnot? I've got a C8, I love it. It's a marvelous machine. What was your involvement with which of the generations of Corvette?
It's funny, for years I worked for General Motors for many years before I was involved in Corvette. First Corvette that I worked on would have been C6. It was well under development when I took over. In fact, one of the first things I had to do was introduce it at the auto show. But the Z06 version of it, of C6, I was very involved in that. C7, and I'll come back to C7 in a second, and then C8 was the last one I was involved in. And you know, my very last day at GM, I blessed the design of the C8, turned in the keys to my office, and I figured I had done enough, and you know, it's time to. Well, the fascinating thing about it was my very first day at GM. You know how there'd been all this talk of a mid-engine Corvette for decades. My very first day, 1972, there were 2 mid-engine Corvettes concepts that were driving past as I'm sitting in personnel signing in, you know, as my very first day, and I see goes by a silver one, then goes another, 2 different designs. You know, one had a 427 and the other one had a 2-rotor engine, and you know, I was like, God, talk about fantasy land. It was just, it was so exciting. Little did I know it would take, you know, my entire career. I was there 44 years, and and my way out the door blessed the design of the first production.
We waited a long time for it, but it came out nice.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, they wait until the right time because, you know, for many years, mid-engine cars, you know, there was overheating issues, the cockpits were difficult, there were, you know, very compromised, not good trunk space. There were so many issues with a mid-engine car. They waited until they could do it right, and they did it right. It's a good team. By the way, you talk about being able to work with other people. I'm also the first head of GM design who did not fight with the head of Corvette. There's quite a history of the head of Corvette arguing. You know, there are all these people talk about Duntov. They love Duntov. Yeah, he and Bill Mitchell did not get along very well, and none of the others really got along well. I got along with Taj. He became a very close colleague in developing those cars. When we developed C7, it was during the depth of bankruptcy. It was a horrible period as a designer. You know, it's kind of hard to create when you've got this cloud over you, and if you're in Detroit, all the news was full of bankruptcy, you know, is the company going to exist, yada, yada, you know. And so I decided we're going to start work on C7. In fact, the company wasn't sure there was going to be a C7. And I decided, well, we're going to go ahead and start anyway. And so I decided the best thing for morale, because I'm all about getting morale, creating the right environment, was, okay, you have the Corvette studio, they have the assignment, but I'm going to give every designer in General Motors globally the opportunity to submit their proposal for this. So you've got designers in the studios in Brazil, in India, Australia, Germany, China, Korea. All of them had opportunity to submit their, I mean, every designer wants to design a Corvette, and I'm actually going to listen to them or see their sketches. And the flood of sketches that came in from the studios, in a couple countries, they had some work laws that said, you know, certain hours, you know, they had their day job. They still had to do their day work. But you couldn't work after hours, so they would take Corvette home. They work on Corvette at home, or they would exit one way from their design building, go in another entrance, and continue to work on Corvette. But it did so much to just bring some energy, not only into design, but the entire company, could not believe what I was doing over there in the design house. And, but at any rate, C7 was a product of that competition. I think some of the best designs, ultimately the Corvette studio had the winning design, but there's a great sketch that came from our studio in India. A couple great ideas came from the studios in Germany, and a great idea came from one of the studios in China as well. But it just did so much to bring energy to the whole organization.
The mythology says you threw them all out after their first submission and had them resubmit. Is that true, or is that myth?
No, it's not quite the way it went. But every one of those designers today feels as though they had a part in developing that car. Whether their design was picked or not, they felt like they were a part of it, and that was pretty cool. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
Who designed the Pontiac Aztec?
Oh,
The question you knew that was coming.
You gotta call John Nikos and tell him they got.
I
But
always said he had something against the president of the company.
Okay. I think I'm glad you brought it up. Actually, it was engineering had a vision for that vehicle. Design had a vision, a very different vision. Actually, they had two different visions. And marketing had yet another vision, and the product was the victim of it. It was done in an environment which those different areas of the company didn't communicate well at all. They didn't talk to each other. They fought. And the vehicle was the victim. The very same designer who worked on that vehicle also designed the C8 Corvette and the C7 Corvette and the Camaro, done in a very different culture. It's all about culture. The very same designer. And, and so, thank you. Thank you for bringing. No, I didn't work on that car. I didn't. The interesting thing, and I'm not trying to duck it or anything, but we had a studio in Germany, and when that car was being themed, I was working in the studio in Germany, but I would get phone calls every day. Ed, you won't believe what they're doing. You won't believe. It started out as a concept of a very, very sporty off-road vehicle with big knobby tires and all that. That was the design vision. Engineering wanted to base it on a mid-sized car so they could share components with the mid-sized car, and they fought, and you get an Aztec. Yeah.
It is also one of those things that I've often wondered about and spoken to designers about as well. When you have a concept, because to me the concept Aztec was actually a fairly interesting looking vehicle.
Yeah.
And there are those things sort of like the slip between plate and lip, where a concept car is introduced, and then when it's productionalized, it loses so much of the flavor of the concept car, for various reasons, for cost, for engineering. How does it make you feel as a designer to say, but you don't understand, this is what it could have been, or do you just do your job and go on?
Well, it's, in that case, and the original concept was even more fascinating than what was shown as a concept vehicle. But it's all about communication. It is, and really developing a great relationship between a creative engineer and a creative designer. Engineers and designers are like they speak different languages and don't always understand each other. And, and if you can get that right relationship and really work together, great things happen. But if you don't have that relationship, then bad things happen, and and designers throw themselves on the floor kicking and screaming, we gotta have this, we gotta have that, and designers end up doing bad things when they don't get the right things from engineering. They frankly, they do. And they try to make up for what was not in the root of the vehicle with, like, costume jewelry or cosmetics to try to make up for it, and then you really run into problems.
Where do the accountants come in?
Well, yeah, the accountants are very much involved, and cost, and that again, that's communication. How do you manage that? In the past, when a program had some serious financial issues deep in the program, you got the design, it's pretty much there, it's all done, and it's too late to make real changes, take it out of the interior. They always take it, they would always take it out, they would cheapen the material, and I think that change really occurred about 25 years ago to really stop that. But the quality of leather went down, the cloth went down. Plastic, not all plastic's created equal. I mean, believe it or not. And there are different grades of plastic, or stampings, instead of stamping it 5 times to get certain shapes, you stamp it 3 times. Big, huge savings. I mean, the machinery that does each one of those stamps is expensive. So if you can do it with 3 stamps as opposed to 5 or 6, you're going to save a huge amount of money, but it also means that you won't have the definition in the final design that you once wanted. Yeah, it's all about, again, working together. Yes.
A few years ago, Chevrolet had an ad campaign where they had this sort of ad hoc focus group where they bring people into a room and then all of a sudden reveal this wonderful vehicle. How much do actual focus groups really are utilized in the design of a lot of these cars, or is it just mostly all on the heads of the designers, or do they really see influence from both sides?
Some designers hate them. I think focus groups are great if you have adult supervision over what's happening there. But I think I like focus groups. I think they can help, but they can't design the vehicle. If there were focus groups on men's ties, and I went into the focus group, and there was a tie that was about that wide, and there's one that was about that wide, and then there's one that's about this wide. I probably picked the design that was most familiar to me, and that kind of happens in focus groups. If they see 3 car designs, the one that kind of is the most familiar to them is the one that they gravitate to, and the ones that maybe be a little jarring to them, they'll get terrible numbers in the clinic. So you find people who try to design the vehicle to win in the clinics, and then they end up not being as progressive a design as they should have been. So I like the clinics, but only in gathering some information, but the design team has really got to make the decisions at the end of the day. Yes.
Oh, Joan.
Joan, yes, an alumni of General Motors Design. Yes.
You were after Chuck Jordan, correct?
I came after Wayne Cherry.
Wayne Cherry, okay.
But yes, technically after Chuck Jordan, yes, yeah.
I have heard that Wayne merged the interior and exterior together. And I'm curious, has it now
There was a point in time when interior and exterior, for years, many years, interior studios were very separate from exterior studios. And there were periods in which they really worked together to do a design that was very consistent inside and out. There was a period where exteriors was doing far more advanced design than interiors, and that didn't quite work. Wayne Cherry, for a while, wanted to bring them much closer together so that they would really work as one team developing the design. I just found that the studios should be next to each other but not merged. I felt as though there are interior designers that are real interior specialists who needed to be respected and given a lot of attention, but it needed to be a separate studio from the exterior studio. Yeah, yeah, yes.
I recently purchased a 96 Seville SLS.
Mm-hmm.
That's the newest Cadillac I've ever had. I've had 20 of them back from 49 up. And I'm quite impressed by how it just fits and slips and waits on me. And, can you tell a little bit about the development of that era of the Sevilles?
96?
96, mid-90s.
I have to, I'm processing back there. What ancient history, you know. Yeah, that was an interesting period because 96, yeah, 96, there was a lot of attention on the interior and good interior space. And if anything, I think they were pushing interior even more than the exterior design. And so interior space, comfort for all the occupants was a big deal. The challenge is, you know, you can make that interior so right, so comfortable, and if you start on that interior way before the exterior, then you end up with an exterior that might be clumsy. Getting that balance between interior design, exterior design, interior space, exterior proportions and style is big challenge. Yeah, big challenge.
It was successful for me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good, good.
That's an old Cadillac at 91, bro. The names that they come up with. When I had to go and try and find the name for something, they call it antelope. What happens in the meeting, in the meetings, I'm saying, when they come up with the names for the colors?
The names for the colors? Oh,
yes.
Oh, gee. Yeah, you know, the color studio is a fun place, and I mean, it's a real fun department. And their backgrounds, you know, wide variety of backgrounds, you know, some from the fashion industry are involved in it. I love the work they do. The names, you know, I just shake my head. Hey, it looks like blue to me, you know. They call it, you know, antelope or whatever, or Nassau. It's blue or it's green, you know, and yeah.
Everybody calls it champagne when you look
Yeah.
at the car.
Yeah.
But I was like, so somebody came into the meeting and said, how about antelope? And they all agreed and said, oh yeah, that sounds good.
It happens all the time, and you know.
On the topic of color, I think this is something that a lot of us talk about. We certainly have the observation, especially looking at the older cars and looking at the cars in the exhibition right now in the museum. The range of colors that were available, especially in the 1950s and 60s. And today, all cars seem to be black, white, and speaking of colors, they have 19 different names for gray.
Yeah. And there are a couple cars in particular in the museum. I think was it the Packard that's in the window?
Yes.
That color is unbelievable. I love it. There's a lot of great color there. Today,
can color ever come back to cars?
It could in some degrees. It does, in particular with the super exotic cars and the hypercars. There's a lot of color there. But color is very dependent. It's interesting. When the economy tightens up, the colors shift. And it's not because of the mood, it's just the concern, can I resell this car? You know, if I get this rose-colored car 3 years from now, can I sell that thing? You know, and dealers, if I bring in, you know, when those cars come in from the factory, after 30 days, they start paying for that car. I believe that's still the way it works. So the dealers don't want this strange color sitting there for over 30 days. And so the dealers tend to order colors that they know they can sell. That has a big influence on what the dealers can sell, what customers are really looking for. It used to be you could not sell a dark color car or a black car in the hot climates. That seems to have changed a bit. That's shifted a bit. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes?
As regards to design, the actual design process, we've all seen where they do sketches and then you'd see full-scale sketches on a wall and play models. With the advent of technology, how is it done today?
Designers still sketch. Just about all of them sketch in the computer, and that's really evolved over time. I remember when those first computer sketches just seemed so, well, they were a turnoff to me. But what they're able to do sketching in a computer today is incredible. Just nothing short of incredible. What they're able to sculpt in the computer is very impressive. Still have clay models. Clay models are very important to me, and they still are to the team. There's so much emotion, there's so much passion that goes into the shaping of a clay model, and being able to look at the design and then make changes, subtle changes. There are things that when you're looking at it in the computer that you may not see a small error that you do see when you have it in 3 dimensions. It's better to catch it in clay than catch it in sheet metal much further into the process. But the process continues to evolve. I don't think they're much in the way of full-size illustrations. I love doing that. That was my favorite way of working, was to do a full-size illustration of the vehicle. And today we have large screens. They, you know, your design comes up on the screen. You know, we have an envisioning center where there are 3 of these screens. Each one is 20 feet by 8 feet, and the designs come up. Not only your designs, but the designs from designers in our locations in Brazil or in Korea or Australia, wherever, you know. And so the communication's incredible. You can have a designer in China and a designer in Michigan working together on a project and work quickly and develop ideas, share ideas, and share issues. You know, if the design team in Korea is having difficulty with something, they can communicate with the designers that we have in North Hollywood, California, quickly. Yeah. Yes. And then
I don't want to monopolize, but electric, everybody's talking about GM's committed to total electric in X number of years. As a designer, does that open great ability for you to be more creative because you don't worry about the height of the engine or anything else those days?
Yeah, I mean, there continue to be challenges. Probably the biggest challenge from a design perspective, electric is expensive, and somehow you've got to offset those costs in some ways, which might be difficult for a designer. But from a pure design perspective, I think it adds some opportunities to really plan the space better. You know, I love the fact that you have a full-size truck that's electric, and then under that hood, there's a nice dry trunk. I think that's terrific. I think that's a terrific use of space, you know, if the vehicle performs, and they've got incredible torque. So I'm excited about that. Yes?
Hi. I was wondering, with your effort, they
However, in my studies, a long time ago, we did projects on GM, and when they wanted to buy out Row, and they put down his ideas of small cars. And meanwhile, you know, kids my age and whatnot, we grew up with some of our teachers getting a Datsun 280Z, that was cool. And some smaller cars from, you know, Volkswagen, etc. If they were so, you know, keen on adapting for the war effort, okay, that's great, it's a war. But why not what the customer was asking for, and then was buying imports? And it just seemed like through the late 70s through the 80s, kids like us want to, you know, get a car, and it's expensive, it's a gas guzzler. I mean, I learned on a 73 Pontiac Le Mans, and that thing was a guzzler. And the trunk rusted out, and we lost detergent on 84. So, you know, we've had all different kinds of cars in my family, but then, of course, those are the days where my father could put his head under the hood and fix it himself, or get a new belt, etc. Can't do that today. But why do they kind of drag their feet about economical cars? I mean, from the time you have a concept and then you have engineering and design, was it too long to do that, to find a smaller car?
No, not at all. I think it was a number of things. Because there were some small cars, but with sales that were so strong on the mid-size and large vehicles, it's kind of hard to change the direction of a ship, you know. I mean, the ship's not as agile as a speedboat, and to get it to turn even a bit is a challenge. And the car companies that you were talking about with Datsun, whatever, that's all they made were small cars. So it's not like they shifted at all. They saw an opportunity and they went after it. They had been making small cars, and only small cars, for many years. Meanwhile, companies like General Motors and Ford and Chrysler were making primarily large cars, and they were very profitable, and they were selling in high volume. So getting that ship to change direction was a challenge, and some people did not want to change direction, or found those cars to be, you know, less than ideal. I know that, you know, one of my predecessors going way back just thought that small cars, you know, they were difficult to style properly. And that was his opinion then and at that time.
Hold on, I'm just going to take just one moment. It's now the time that we're actually going to move to the museum for our reception. And you can certainly ask Mr. Welburn some additional questions there. And two things, I want to actually thank you for bringing up a great item that this September 29th to the 2nd, for the Audrain Newport Concours Motor Week, Mr. Welburn will be giving a seminar on a wonderful topic, a great topic for a film project on which he is working. This seminar will be called Erased, about pioneer black auto racing drivers. And I'm very excited to hear about that. And to the gentleman who asked the question about packaging in electric cars, Michael Simcoe, the current occupant of this chair, and Franz von Holzhausen from Tesla will be talking about design and repackaging. So the two seminars, we'll be putting our seminars actually on sale this coming week.
Yes.
You can buy your tickets right now. And once again, thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you, everyone.
And look forward to entertaining Ed in our museum now. Thank you all very much for coming.
Okay.
Step over to the museum.
Thank you.